Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session today, LGBTQIA, Student Engagement and Intersectionality in Higher Education. Before we begin, I wanted to cover some housekeeping items. Please keep your cameras off and microphones muted throughout the session. If you have any questions, please use the chat feature. We will get to as many of them as we can at the end of the session. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Brent Lewis. Dr. Lewis serves as the Associate Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at James Madison University. His office includes multicultural student services, international student services, and institutional diversity. He earned his PhD in Leadership Studies from North Carolina A&T State University. He has worked in higher education for 10 years at various types of colleges and universities. He has held positions at Fayetteville State University, North Carolina Central University, and the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Dr. Lewis is passionate about diversity and inclusion and creating safe and affirming spaces for LGBTQ students. His research agenda has focused on the lived experiences of gay and lesbian students attending historically Black colleges and universities. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lewis. Thank you for being with us this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me this morning for this awesome conference. And thank you to those of you that are attending this session. I know you had a couple of other options to choose, so I'm glad that you decided to spend time with me. And I'm going to leave some time towards the end of this session for you to ask me questions. I'm also going to have some space throughout the presentation for you to engage in some activities with me in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and start in terms of sharing my screen. So before I start, I'll share a little bit about myself. I know you heard my bio, but what I will say is that I've spent a lot of my time in higher education working with LGBTQ students and looking at the intersections of their experiences and their challenges. I started my career in higher education as a residence hall director in housing and residence life. I've also taught part-time at a community college, at Guilford Technical Community College in Greensboro, North Carolina. So I was very excited to see a community college leading a diversity and inclusion workshop or conference. I think it's important to the work that we do within the community college spaces, but also in four-year institutions. So I hope that something I share today is something you can take back to your individual campus, whether you're at a four-year, a community college, four-year private, four-year public. I hope it'll be transformative for the work you do. So again, my name is Brent Lewis. I currently serve as the Associate Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion within the Division of Student Affairs at James Madison University. So some of our topics today will be safe spaces, gender pronouns, inclusion, campus resources, intersectionality, gender identity, and then diversity, equity, and inclusion as an umbrella oversight for the work that happens on college campuses. So I'll start with my own personal philosophy of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because I believe that drives intersectionality. It drives the work that I do with students on campus. I feel that we should build a campus culture that is inclusive, affirming, equitable, and accessible to all students. I picked those words because I think they have power and they have value, and students can see through language when we are a safe space for them, when it's an inclusive space for them. And then these are just working definitions that I use to describe terms diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think diversity is us acknowledging differences, the differences that make us who we are, the differences that shape us, the power in acknowledging the differences and the work that we're able to do together. I think equity takes a long range look at fair treatment, equal access and opportunity for everyone, works to eliminate barriers, and it requires an understanding of root issues and causes for disparities within our society. So when we talk about the equity work, We have to go beyond identifying differences and representation and acknowledgement of the differences, but what are the barriers that impact people in the differences that they bring? And then the last thing I'll share about this is inclusion, inviting the diverse perspectives or identities to the space, to the table, and listening to those voices, providing voices to be heard, included, part of the process, including students in the decision-making process. An inclusion model thinks about the underrepresented communities on your campus, or the students who identify as marginalized on campus. We're not just thinking about the majority, we're looking across all intersections of identities on our campuses. So I want you to take a moment and think about when you hear the terms or acronym LGBTQ, what are your initial thoughts? And you can drop it in the chat. What are some assumptions that you've thought or people have thought? What are some stereotypes you think people associate with LGBTQ? What are just things that just kind of resonate or come up when you hear that acronym LGBTQ? Okay, different. I think I'm a part of that. Alternative lifestyles. Well, y'all are typing fast. Proud, rainbows, stereotypes, feminine men, masculine women, proud mama, gay rights, uncomfortable, I'm afraid of doing something wrong, confusion, need support, discrimination, often struggling with home issues. A lot of the things that you're dropping in this chat are absolutely experiences that my students have had, experiences that I've had, inclusive but limiting, okay. Biphobia, transphobia, homophobia, attention seeking, yeah, that's definitely a stereotype. Marginalized populations, pride, don't pry, it's good. I don't like having to refer to a group of people using a set of initials, that's good. That, I don't even know when the acronym came about, to be honest, because when I was in college, I don't remember the terminology LGBTQ. I really don't remember. Somewhere in the mix of me graduating undergrad, going to grad school, and starting to work in the field, I started to hear this acronym more and more and more. Barbara, I agree with you. It's not discussed enough on campuses, and there's a lack of education. But we have students who are queer, or we have colleagues who are queer. So because there's that lack of understanding, that lack of recognition, that lack of acknowledgement, it impacts how we're able to do business. It impacts how we're able to support students. It impacts how we're able to strategize and really make decisions that are critical to our students and their experiences. So thank you for the things that you're dropping in the chat. It's really helpful to the conversation, and it's good just so I can test where everyone is in this room on the topic, because the reality is all of us are going to have a different range of knowledge on queer experiences. One, if you're part of the community, you'll have one narrative. If you're an advocate or an ally, you will have another narrative. If you work in this work on a college campus, you'll have a different experience because you have the lived experiences of your students. So it just looks different based on where you are in this work, your level of comfortability, and your knowledge. So thank you for sharing in the chat. So let's talk for a minute, because when I do these trainings or these sessions, one thing that I never want to assume, yes, so before I go there, yes, I see the question in the chat. You are using the word queer. Is that okay to use? Yes, it is. Queer used to be a really derogatory term in the 80s and probably 70s, maybe even in the 90s. But at some point, 90s, early 2000s, the LGBTQ community took power back of the term queer. And so people do identify and use that term to describe their experiences. And we'll talk some more about that. Now, it also is generational, because For older LGBTQ individuals, it might be something that they feel like is discriminatory or a derogatory term. So it really depends on who you're talking to and really what age group they are in, because that is also the diversity that makes up LGBTQ. You know, when I was growing up, so I had a gay uncle, and he was, at this point, he's probably in his 60s. His perspective on it is very different than mine. I'm in my 30s, so it's individualized and it's also generational. So let's talk about terminology and language. I'm going to give some brief definition on terminology. Again, these are working definitions that I've used. This is not the end all be all. I just think that in talking about intersectionality and talking about queer experiences, we need to kind of start with some baseline of what these terms basically mean. So I won't go line by line, word for word, because I know everyone in this session is some way connected to higher education, so we all can read. But this is just a generalizable group of definitions to describe some of the terminology that we use. I think a lot of times we use terms or we drop acronyms and people don't really know what it means. Like, for example, I'm in conversation with people and I'll say cis hetero, meaning a cisgender heterosexual person, but everyone doesn't know what cisgender means. So cisgender is an individual whose gender identity is consistent with their biological sex. So it's the opposite of transgender. And I try to make sure that, and sometimes when transgender, we'll say trans for short, TRANS. I try to use terms and spell it out before I use the short acronym version of it. Regina, we will talk about binary and non-binary experiences, because that is definitely a part of this conversation and a part of the identities groups, which you will probably work with in terms of your students. Can you speak to the expansion of the acronym to LGBTQIA+? Yes, I will. So bisexual, a person who's sexually, emotionally, relationally attracted to more than one sex or gender. Gay is usually describing a man that's emotionally and relationally attracted to other men. However, there are lesbians who will use the term gay. Lesbian is usually the term to describe a woman who's sexually, emotionally, or relationally attracted to other women. And an ally is essentially an advocate, a support system for the community. An ally can be someone that's within the community, but an ally can also be someone who's outside of the LGBTQ community. And I appreciate allies that are outside of the community, because allies outside of the community have a different voice than sometimes those of us that are in the community have. I've done workshops and trainings on campuses with individuals who didn't understand my perspective or what I was trying to say, but an ally came into the conversation and said something very similarly, and it made sense, or the connection was there. So it's definitely important on your campuses for allyship for students. Queer is an umbrella term to describe anyone whose behavior or expression challenges notions of binary, gender, and heteronormative constructs. Queer could describe a person's sexuality. It could describe their expression. It could describe how they dress, how they show up. A person could be androgynous and identifies queer. Queer is very umbrella term like. It challenges the notion of what we consider to be the norm. It challenges anything that says it has to function this way. It has to be from a binary perspective. Again, I'm moving pretty quickly, but I want to talk about pronouns. These are not all the pronouns. This is not an all exhaustive list of pronouns. These are just the pronouns that as a professional, I've dealt with more with students. Some of our students will identify with she, her, hers. Some students will identify with he, him, his. And some students will identify with they, them, theirs. They, them, theirs sometimes trips people up in education because it doesn't always make sense. But again, that's a space for your non-binary students or your students who identify as gender non-conforming, or your students who may identify as gender fluid. It's an open space where they can be who they want to be. You may hear some students describe this as preferred pronouns. You may also hear students use the term chosen pronouns. And so on some campuses, those terms are interchangeable. I know some campuses are working on preferred pronoun policies so that students can go into whatever system you use, such as Banner or Canvas or Blackboard, and update their preferred name, their preferred pronouns. So their preferred name or chosen name shows up on faculty rosters. When I was at Fayetteville State University, that was something we worked on, where students could actually go into Blackboard and update that themselves. They could go to our card office and have their preferred name listed on their student card, because that was important to our students. So it's important that the university or the institution that you're at think through, what can you do? What can you do to make students feel more comfortable or feel more safe in their spaces? If they can go and update their own name on the roster before faculty get it, that in itself will stop a microaggression or an awkward conversation having to happen for a trans student or a non-binary student on the first day of class or the first couple of days of class. Some people do think that preferred name, the term preferred, is a microaggression. So like I said, some people will use the term chosen name because they feel like preferred name is a microaggression. Again, that is individualized. Some students and some individuals have their own preferences. So as you get to know your students, as you get to know individuals, you will know what they're comfortable with, what they're safe with, and what they identify as affirming. So it's not one size fits all. I don't want anyone to walk away and say, we have to do all of this the same way with all queer students, because it's going to be some individualized approaches with students. And it's okay if you need to ask a student how they identify because of a reason of your position at the institution. Now, if you're just asking just to be nosy, that's different. But if you're working with a student in residence life, or you work in the registrar's office, or you work in financial aid, or you're in admission, there are some reasons and some times when you do have to have these types of difficult conversations with students. And you need to be comfortable doing that, because there will be times when you have to have those conversations. And if you're just trying to dance around it and try not to be awkward, you can't. We're gonna get more students who are in the queer community on our campuses. So it's important that we're proactive in how we work with our students in engagement. I see some chat happening in the chat. I'm happy that you all are chatting and having some thoughts. Thank you for what you're saying. Again, it's individualized and everyone's going to have their own perspective on this conversation, this topic. We all have our own strengths in this work. So I appreciate everyone sharing their perspectives and their thoughts on it. One thing that I will also say is that when doing this work, sometimes people think that sexuality also equals gender expression or gender identity. That is not the same. It's not one and the same. Gender identity is how people internally feel who they are, how they identify. That's not always aligned with sexual orientation or sexuality. Gender expression is how people manifest or physically express who they are. That could be mannerisms, that could be clothing, that could be behavior. It's not always what we believe it to be. Sometimes there's assumptions or stereotypes about the community. If you're a man and you have feminine features or feminine behavior, you're automatically gay. It's not true. Or for women, if they are masculine presenting, Many times they're often assumed to be lesbian. That's not always the case. And so we have to be careful with students and how you categorize and describe them, how you label them based on what they wear, how you label them based on their accessories that they may wear. That's not always the correct story. So listen to people's narrative, get to know their experiences and their story and their truths. Then you get a better picture for who people are. I describe sexuality and gender identity in two different ways. Now, this is just my way. This is not saying it's the only way. I view sexuality, who you lay down with, who you are interested in being romantically, emotionally with. Gender identity, who you lay down as, who do you feel like you are? Who do you internalize yourself to be? How do you identify? What makes you feel who you are? That doesn't always align with how people show up physically. And so sometimes people do work to change those things. As I think about the lens of higher education, these were just some thoughts that I had as I was working on this presentation about LGBTQ students and our campus resources. And I thought from the admission process, how do we start off engaging LGBTQ students? How do we know who our trans students are? Do our campuses ask anything in the application process so that in the application, from application to orientation to opening move-in day, that we know who our students are? I'll give you an example about why I put this here. When I was a hall director, I had a trans student move into my residence hall. On paper, we had her housed with male students because legally she still birth gender was male. Well, I had to kind of fight with our housing team and others on campus to say, we can't put her with a male identified roommate. It's not safe. But we didn't know that the student was trans. The student had come to orientation. The student had been admitted. We'd gone through all this process. We didn't find out she was trans until move-in day. And so if we could be more proactive in processes, whatever that looks like, I think we will have a different experience with our students because we're able to prepare for them proactively versus reactively trying to find a room that houses a single person, or having to have a conversation with parents of cis women to say, would your parents feel comfortable with a trans woman living with you? These are the nuances that we start to run down in the rabbit hole when we are reactive. Student health services. Our campus is prepared to offer hormone therapy and testosterone therapy and PrEP to students who request it. I've worked in spaces where the health center is mostly women who are religious and who are very nervous to have these types of conversations with students, or are because of their religious perspective, they feel the student is wrong, so they're not as willing to help the student. We've got to get around our own assumptions, biases, and perspectives because, again, we're engaging a student population that is going to expect us to be ready for them. Because the reality is, students are out in high school, students are out in middle school, students are out in elementary school. In the age of social media, they know about all of these services. So we can't just be reactive in our approach. What types of counseling services are we providing for students, especially for our non-binary or students who identify as trans that want to go through any process of reassignment surgery? There's a counseling component associated with that. Are our campuses, counseling centers adequately prepared? Are they working with therapists in the community that are having to do this intersectional alignment with students? I've worked with trans students who've had counselors in the community, but they also had a counselor on our campus to sign off on things for them. So where are these services at? I've worked in spaces where I've had to send a student from Fayetteville to Raleigh because we didn't have certain resources in Fayetteville, North Carolina for the student. So it's also important that the campus knows what is in the community if you don't have it on campus. I had a great relationship with Planned Parenthood in Fayetteville because I could work with them to send students there for certain things that they needed. I had a trans man who needed a binder. Well, we worked with Planned Parenthood to get that. So there's things that the university has to have someone there who understands this language. So if you don't have a chief diversity officer, or if you don't have a multicultural center, or who's having these conversations with students around safety, around sexuality, around queerness. The other topic I'll go to is campus programs and engagement. What types of programming is your university or institution providing around this topic? Is there any type of engagement with clubs and organizations? Are there campus events? If you have Greek life on your campus, are you having conversations about how Greek life could be more inclusive for LGBTQ students? These are tough conversations that need to happen. And in some spaces, they are happening. Some institutions are doing a really good job with campus programming, engagement of students, and having difficult conversations that need to be had. Does your institution have any area of campus ministry or religion and spirituality? Because as we talk about intersectionality, I believe that religion and spirituality is a huge part of the crossroads for queer students, because many of them grow up in religious homes or religious households, and they want to keep that part of their identity, but they don't know how to navigate being queer and being Christian, or being queer and being Muslim. It can be very difficult for our students to navigate their LGBTQ identity and some form of religion that may have been part of their life at home. What retention initiatives are in place? We have a lot of mentorship programs in higher ed, but I don't know how many of them are linked to LGBTQ. So on my current campus, we just worked with the Alumni Affairs Office to start a Lavender chapter, which is a lavender group of LGBTQ alum from the university. This group had their first program last night, because this week is our homecoming. They had a virtual program last night with our current LGBTQ students, and we're working on a mentorship program where queer alum will mentor current LGBTQ students. It's a wraparound, holistic approach to their experience. Yes, we do have an LGBTQ center on campus, and it's great, but it's nice to have a person who went here, who navigated this space, who was misunderstood in their identity in some form, who can reach back to the current student to say, let's think about this, or this was my experience, and these are the places that I went to feel support or to get support while at the institution, or while in Harrisonburg, you can go here. It's great for us at the university to provide it, but it's a different layer of support from people who have lived it and gone through it. I didn't go to JMU, so I don't know the queer experience as a student. All right, so think about intentional and strategic ways of holistically supporting our students. Do we have multicultural student services on campus, or do we have an LGBTQ resource center on our campus? Because that will help drive your inclusive language on campus. Your training and development for faculty and staff can be connected to that. In addition, your programming models and programming around LGBTQ topics or intersectionality can be connected to that. There's a lot of ways in which a center could be helpful. Now, in some spaces, it can seem that students might think a multicultural space is othering them. That's not the approach that we want to do. We don't want it to come off as an othering. We want it to come off as a addition to. It's an add-on. You don't have to use this service, but it's here if you need it, if it provides that sense of belonging at the university for you. It's here. And the last thing I'll share is I come from a student affairs background, but I also believe that as we talk about queer topics and intersectionality, we've got to review the curriculum. What is happening in the classroom that aligns with a lot of this co-curricular that I've just talked about? The multicultural services, the campus ministries, campus programs, retention initiatives, a lot of that is a co-curricular framework. But how does that align with academic affairs? Are there courses where we're talking about gender studies, queer experiences, being queer and Black, being queer and Latinx? The classroom experience has got to be an addition to the co-curricular, because every student won't go to a program. Every student won't go to an event. It's important that we have faculty who are able to embed this into the curriculum to have these difficult conversations as well. So as we talk about the term intersectionality, again, these are just working definitions that I use. It's an interconnected nature of social categories such as race, class, gender identity, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, as they're given to an individual group, creating overlapping or intersecting systems of discrimination or disadvantage. So our identities don't move in silos. They move together. So if you're Black and queer and a Christian and middle class, you're all of those things all the time. And you can't separate them out. You can't show up to a job interview and just be Chris, the Black man. You're more than that identity. So some of our identities are not visible. You might have a disability that's not visible, but it's still there. It still impacts your lived experiences. So we have to acknowledge that students are navigating more than one challenge or one barrier on our campuses, than just what we can see or what we know about. So I want you to take a moment and think, have you ever considered how the intersections of your identities have impacted your lived experiences? Just take a moment and sit with that. Have you ever considered how the intersections of your identities, how you identify? Think about all the ways in which you identify. Even if you need to sit down and list out the way in which you identify, how have they impacted your lived experiences in different spaces? Think about that for a second. Now, as you think about this, as you jot down your own personal identities and think about ways in which you've ever considered how they've impacted your lived experiences, I want you to grab a pen and paper or your cell phone or your iPad or your computer, pull up a Word document. I'm going to play a quick activity with you. Now, I want you to write one identity. You only get to write one identity based on each question. Question 1, the part of my identity that I am most aware of on a daily basis is. Do not put these in the chat. These are personalized to you. Write or type or put it wherever you're working on it. The part of my identity that I am most aware of on a daily basis is. And you can only pick one. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly as I'm looking at the time. The part of my identity that I am least aware of on a daily basis is. The part of my identity that I am least aware of on a daily basis is. Number 3, the part of my identity that was most emphasized or most important in my family growing up was. What was most emphasized in your household? The part of my identity that provides me the most privilege is. The part of my identity that provides me the most privilege is. For those of us that come from marginalized communities, it's hard for us to think about this term. It's hard for us to conceptualize having privilege, but some of us do. And we have to dig deep within ourselves to find where that is. The part of my identity that I believe is the most misunderstood by others is. The part of my identity that I believe is the most misunderstood by others. Now, again, you can only choose one. And the last one is the identity that makes me feel discriminated against is. You can only choose one. Okay, drop in the chat. What were you thinking as you were doing this exercise? Was it hard? Was it easy? Did it make you think about yourself in ways in which you identify? Just drop some things in the chat about this activity and anything that resonated with you. Lots of the same answer. I've done this more than once and I've had a hard time with it. This was hard, difficult because I had to pick just one. Yep, it was somewhat difficult. Made me think about what hurts me. Yeah, Janice, the first time I done it, it done the same for me. It's harder to detangle some identities than I thought. Yeah. It was very challenging to choose just one part of my identity for multiple answers. Great exercise made me think of a few things. I had to pick at a time, picking only one. Some were hard, some were difficult. It's interesting. I wanted you to do this because it is painful sometimes, but the other piece about that is that it's painful for our students because they're trying to pick apart how to show up, how to be vulnerable, where they can be safe, where they can be all of their identities, where they can be authentic on our campuses. So as you think about how hard it was for you to pick one, it's hard for students to show up and pick one on campus and think about, do they have to hide any of these identities? Do I have to hide the religious piece on campus? Do I have to hide my queerness on campus? Are there people on campus that will support me if I'm fluid or if I'm queer or if I'm non-binary? So this takes me to the next slide, intersectionality at the margins. Choosing the privileged part was really hard for me too, Dr. Kimberly, because I had to really think about where did that exist for me. And now, yes, someone else in the chat said, my privilege may not afford me the same opportunities as others' privilege. That is very true. That is very true. And so we have to think about that too. With intersection at the margins, queer students identify with, think about different ways in which they may identify. A queer student that's religious. Intersections of being LGBTQ and race. That is a big one. LGBTQ and white looks very different from LGBTQ and Black, LGBTQ and Latinx, LGBTQ and Pacific Islander. The experience is just different. And I don't have the time this morning to go into why that looks very different, but there are some privileges that exist on the white side that don't exist in other spaces of being LGBTQ and a person of color. Being a first gen student comes with its own challenges. So combine being first gen and queer. You've already thinking about not knowing what to expect about college, but then you add on, I don't know what to expect about college, and I don't know what to expect about being in college and being queer. LGBTQ and student athletes. Most of the time, your athletes that identify in the queer community are not out. They are closeted. They will stay that way. Most of them in the people that you do see the most out in athletics are usually women who identify as lesbian, but also it sometimes makes them feel stereotyped, because then there becomes this stereotype that all women that play basketball are lesbians. Not true. But in some instances, that is a space where you do see student athletes who are out. But that's a narrative in itself. trying to navigate being LGBTQ and an athlete, navigating being LGBTQ and Greek affiliated, another very masculine space where people may not always share their safety of being queer in that space. LGBTQ and a student with a disability, it's two different pieces of their identity that they're trying to navigate. LGBTQ and socioeconomic status. This comes into play where if you have a student who has more access to income or access to money, there are pieces of their experience that they can shift based on their access to money. Teresa, I see your question. I think that has to start with the university and the leadership in athletics. It has to be a priority for the coaches. I've done workshops with coaches. That's a very hyper masculine. Athletics is a very masculine presenting space, and it's not always supportive from the leadership within that unit. So it's got to be some culture created around athletics that this is a space where you can be who you are. It's a safe space. We understand. We're looking to understand your experiences. Men are often taught you can't cry, you can't be feminine, you can't show emotion. So that also translates into the athletic world. And so there's a lot of layers that you have to unpack with athletes, and they have to have someone in that space who gets them and their experience. That may not be us. It might be someone who works in athletics, but is affirming. Keeping your students involved. Some campuses have LGBTQ student orgs. It's important to do some assessment. What's happening? What's the climate? What's the culture? Are you doing surveys with students on campus to assess the campus climate around LGBTQ experiences? Are focus groups happening with students? Identifying queer students who are willing to serve in leadership roles on campus. As we go back to the programming piece and the campus engagement pieces, student leaders play a huge role in that. So involving students who are out on campus and involved, encourage them to take on leadership roles like in SGA or the Student Activities Board, so that their voices can be heard at different tables and different spaces. If you don't have a resource center on your campus that deals with multicultural affairs, that may be somewhere you want to start, or even having a person on campus who leads initiatives from a different unit. I worked on one campus where we had an assistant director for multicultural education, but her position was housed in student activities. So we didn't have to create a whole new department. We created a new position, but housed it with an existing department. So there's ways to strategize and do this work. Intentional programming, I can't say that enough. Institutional support, it can't just come from student affairs or academic affairs. This has to be a universal design that's embedded into the institutional culture. Diversity work has to be important to everyone, no matter what their role at the university or college is, whether that's you work in campus grounds, you work in the dining facilities. If you interact with students, it needs to be an institutional priority. And it has to start at the leadership. So the president or the chancellor, whatever the term on your campus, has to be invested. It can't be a bottom-up approach. There's got to be some leadership investment. Collaboration across campus and across departments would be helpful in this work. Social media presence, document what's happening. That's a recruitment tool, that's a retention effort. Document the good things that you're doing on your campus to engage students. Students are looking for an intersectional experience. Students do not view us as siloed spaces the way we do. Sometimes we silo student services and academics, athletics, and the business office. We function from all these different separate ways, but students don't see us that way. They see us as one institution, one entity. So find ways to collaborate so that you provide an intersectional approach to the work with students. Create safe spaces, allyship, be supportive and affirming of your students, and A group that I didn't spend much time talking about was employees. You have faculty and staff who identify as LGBTQ. Provide supportive spaces for them as well so that they can also help the student population that identify within the community. When I worked at another institution, we had a group on campus that was kind of like a student org, but it was an org for faculty and staff who identified as LGBTQ. And we were a support system for each other, but we also done a lot of this for student groups. We partnered with our queer identifying grad student groups, our groups for undergrads, because your grad students, if you're at a university that has grad students, they're going to have a different experience than your undergrads. And a lot of the services and programming usually is tailored towards undergraduates. So that's something we have to think about as well. Wake Tech Advice, and I see your question. Yes, I do offer it. I'll put my email address on the last slide and feel free to reach out. I'm happy to assist. Listen without judgment. Appropriately refer your students to campus resources for assistance if you have resources on campus. If you don't have resources on campus, send them to places in the community, like in Raleigh and in Durham, North Carolina. They have LGBTQ centers that are in the community. So if you don't have a space on your campus, there are some cities, I think Charlotte, North Carolina has a space in the city. There's resources that are available to students, even if it's not on your physical campus. Someone just needs to know the resource. Queer initiatives will assist with issues surrounding the transition into college that are unique for LGBTQ students. All students have a challenge transitioning to college, but it looks even more different for queer students. And then visible support. So if you offer safe space training on your campus or a safe zone training on your campus, do you provide some stickers or some visibility so students know where they can go and feel safe? Best practice: use inclusive language, offer a visible and supportive presence, develop policy if you don't have any, or align your current policies to be more inclusive, increase your awareness of issues and concerns, provide professional development for your faculty and staff, and consider the multiple identities of your queer students and the ways those intersections have impacted their lived experiences. This is just some do's and don'ts. Use inclusive language, like affirming, supportive, welcoming. Never force your students to come out. Don't out students. If a student comes out to you or invites you into who they are, that means they feel safe with you. How does this benefit you? You can utilize these tips to foster a positive and safe campus environment. It improves conditions for LGBTQ students and behavior of non-LGBT students. If you have positive interactions with your students, they will be more confident at the institution, which will make them more successful. Success in all areas, such as retention and academics. Marketing an inclusive campus will help your recruitment strategies, and it will positively address some of the common issues that students have, such as academic challenges and harassment. Theory to practice. This is for everyone that works at an institution. What is your strategy for improving the experience of LGBTQIA students on your campus? And what campus resources do you provide LGBTQIA students that help retain them and create a sense of belonging at your institution? These are things that I want you to leave this session thinking about. What is your strategy? And what do you currently do? Or what do you currently have in place that is successful, that is effective, that's working? How do you know? Have you done any assessment? What are the stories that need to be told? What is your narrative? I will now open it up for questions.
Dr. Lewis, thank you so much. You've done such a wonderful job of answering as we've gone along. And I hope everyone will take advantage of you sharing your email address there. And we are going to have to go over to our next session. So I'm going to share my screen if that's okay.
Okay.
So thank you everyone for attending this wonderful session. Please check the chat room for the links to the next sessions. because we will be closing this in just a few seconds. Dr. Lewis, we thank you again so very much. This has been so helpful and informative and challenging for everyone.
Thank you so much for having me. Again, my email is there. Any of you, please reach out if you just need some conversation, things to think about for your institution. You want a safe space training on your campus. Happy to engage in any way I can.
Thank you.